So we decided to do our project on challenging white supremacy within university dorms, or more specifically within university residence halls. And so I guess the first question is just kind of why university housing? Why did we choose university housing for our project? And so we recognize that within the dorms, there's on average anywhere between 200 to 400 residents living within a single dorm on the University of Montana's campus. And it's close quarters. A lot of people have their first experience in college in the dorms. It's their first time away from home. And we just have to be frank in recognizing that racism exists within the dorms. Discrimination exists within the dorms. And one person who is present on each floor, which is responsible for making a welcoming and kind of open community and comforting community, is the RA. And so we wanted to prepare and look at the training for RAs to make sure that they were prepared to handle these issues of discrimination and handle these issues of racism. And so they're often the first point of contact when an incident regarding racism or discrimination occurs. Usually residents and RAs have very close relationships. That's kind of the first person that the resident is able to go to in regards to that. They are responsible for making the dorm feel like comforting and welcoming. A resident shouldn't feel like they're on guard or they have to watch their back or they have to be worried about somebody down the hall. And on average, the RA has about 35 residents on their floor here at the University of Montana, and that can fluctuate. But 35 residents living within close proximity of each other for a year sets up potential for racism and discrimination. And so the overview of the project, we all have been RAs, and we've all witnessed various forms of discrimination and racism within our jobs. And as an RA, I've witnessed and been a part of multiple incidents with racism and have realized that many RAs, including myself, are not properly trained. And because of that, we make uninformed decisions which can negatively impact residents, specifically residents of color or LGBTQ+, or any other residents belonging to a minority group. And so the problem that we're trying to solve is helping to dismantle racism and discrimination within the residence halls of the University of Montana through preparing the RAs to handle those situations, to recognize their role in these situations. And then how is this project meeting the goal of dismantling white supremacy? We're working with Housing to make changes to the RA book, altering training for the RAs so they're more prepared to handle this. And we also want to make sure that RAs themselves are aware of their actions and their privileges with dealing within these conflicts. And I'll just give a really quick story of an example that I witnessed this year. So one of my coworkers, there was an incident on his floor involving an overtly racist and kind of threatening act towards one of his residents. And he found out about it through another resident, and so he wasn't there on the scene. And so all the evidence and everything was kind of gone by the time he found out about it, but he didn't really know what to do. He didn't necessarily know who to call. He didn't really know how to comfort the resident. And because of that, I don't want to blame him or demonize him for what he did. He just wasn't properly trained. But what he did, he was focusing on the person who committed this act. And the resident who's the victim of this act was kind of lost in the shuffle. And that resident didn't know what to do and was left looking for their own resources. And that's the absolute last thing that we should be doing as RAs. And so our training is supposed to help prepare RAs for those situations so that they feel comfortable handling these situations and they have a better guideline of what to do and how to follow up with those residents so that they don't get lost in the melee, they don't feel confused, they don't feel lost.
Yeah, and there seems to be like a separation between like RAs and how to do things. and then how the superiors of the RAs want them to do things. It was, I think, the first week of training, and we just got done listening to a presentation by Allies. They were talking about discrimination in the dorm halls, and that if two roommates were together and one of them was discriminating on the other, that we should find another room. That's the first thing we should do, is make sure that everyone's comfortable. Later that day, I was in my room, and I got a knock on the door, and this man came in, and he was big. He was like, I can't live with a gay guy. He said that to me. He said, I can't live with a gay man. And I was like, he was scared. He was scared, but it was like intimidating at the same time. So he was kind of stuttering his words, and he told me, I can't live with a gay man. And he didn't even meet his roommate yet. He said he looked him up on Facebook, and he saw that he had a rainbow flag on it, right? So I told him, okay, well, I said I'll talk to my superior and I'll see what I can do. So I wrote a report, I talked to my supervisor, and she said, I want to meet with this man, and we could talk to him about what he's doing wrong, you know. So like in the midst of all this, I felt like she didn't want to move him out, that there was sort of like this want to reprimand him and make a point by making him live with someone who was, that he was afraid of and discriminated against. And I felt like, well, what's this going to do to the other guy, you know? So I met the other roommate. He came in one day, and what ended up happening is he didn't move into the dorms. He left. He walked into the room one day. I don't know what happened, but I never saw him again. So I think there is that point of making people feel comfortable, but also remembering who we need to take care of in the dorms. And I think sometimes it's the person who's getting discriminated against that gets forgotten about. And that's what happened in that case. The kid, he got reprimanded, he got yelled at. I don't think that changed anything in his views, you know. So I think there was a separation between what I felt like I wanted to do and what, happened. I didn't really know how to handle that. All I said was, I talked to my supervisor, So I don't think it really helped anybody out at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so keeping kind of those stories in mind when approaching this project, we went ahead and just kind of developed a plan to help RAs, like my colleague and my other colleague was an RA as well, help us feel prepared, help us feel comfortable handling with these situations. I think so much of the time RAs feel uncomfortable handling these situations and therefore end up doing nothing, and that ends up leaving the victim kind of lost and confused and hurt and guarded and worried. And so just this is a brief overview. We'll get into it a little bit more. But we went through the handbook that is given to RAs at the beginning of the year and went through it and picked out the pieces that really needed to be bolstered and built up, and giving RAs a better guideline on how to follow up with residents. Often it addressed how to deal with the incident initially, but then there was nothing to follow up. How do you make sure that the resident has the resources and the information that they need? And also to improve upon the contact list and the resource list. So we went through and did that as well. And we also wanted to develop a policy-centric training for RAs. So this isn't necessarily an anti-racism training because of the limited time that RAs have within their training, and because they have to fit so much of it in, we figured if we focused on the policy aspect of the training and clearly stating what is expected of RAs in their job, what the University of Montana and what Housing expects them to do in these situations, and to make that clear. That was going to help us address this issue a little bit better. And then we wanted to adjust the existing format to maximize the limited time of training in order to make the most of what RAs were experiencing, what RAs were going through.
Okay, so one of the things that we did was pull from a lot of different literature to kind of look at some themes and see how that was aligning with our project. So one of the first themes is residence life experience and then campus climate implications. So there's a ton of literature on residence life experience, especially for first year students, and how it's a really integral part of the educational experience, and that it can really make or break someone's college experience. We've already heard a couple stories that probably really influence those people's college experiences. So, so that was one of the things that we sort of pulled in. And the other thing is, what does a campus climate look like, and how does that influence people of color? So there's a lot of work being done right now on this campus in terms of campus climate and how do we measure that. And something that I thought was really poignant is, I think that in this class we think a lot about how do people of color operate in the world, and what are the things that they have to deal with that like I wouldn't have to deal with as a white person. But sometimes I think that on college campuses we act like we're immune from that, and like my colleagues were saying, we are not immune from that. So something that I thought was a really good quote, and I'll read it to you since it's a little long. The basic assimilationist offer that schools make to blacks: you can be valued and rewarded in school and society. The schools say to these students, but first you must master the culture and ways of the American mainstream, and since that mainstream, as it is represented, is essentially white, this means you must give up many particulars of being black: styles of speech and appearance, value, priorities, preferences, at least in mainstream settings. This is asking a lot. For too many black students, school is simply the place where more concertedly, persistently, and authoritatively than anywhere else in society, they learn how little valued they are. And so that quote is from Claude Steele. They're a social psychologist at the University of California at Berkeley, and one of the articles we read was written by them. And what I thought was really important is that it reminded me a little bit of what we heard from our colleague earlier about, now that Obama is president, there is no racism anymore, and that like as white institutions, we accept people who are palatable to whiteness, or whatever, however you would want to phrase that. So the experience in the campus climate is a big part of the research that was infused in this. Another big theme that kept coming up is a resurgence of strength-based and restorative justice approaches. And the reason that I use the word resurgence is because these ideas are not new, but I think recently in academia they've sort of caught on, and sometimes in white academic circles we act like they're new. For example, restorative justice approach is really rooted in indigenous practices. It doesn't always get the credit that it deserves for that. And I think what's really important, and I won't go into it too much, but basically a strength-based approach is exactly as it sounds, trying to focus on people's strengths and pull those out and utilize them to help them with resiliency and other factors that they might be needing. Excuse me. And then a restorative justice approach really focuses on, rather than a punitive approach, trying to restore justice through working with the person that was affected, or working with the community and trying to bring justice about in that way. And I think that both of these are really important ways to look at the world and ways to practice this kind of work. However, if we look at it from a colorblind perspective and we don't think about all of the factors that help people came to that place, we might look at it, as we heard from my colleague, like the story that he shared about sort of looking at everybody as equals and trying to maybe reprimand them, rather than thinking about what's the positionality of all these people that are involved in this process. And then I know we've talked about critical race theory. That was a really big part of the literature we used. And then also the impact of microaggressions. And I think it's also important to note that in some of the literature we are reading, that microaggressions are sometimes identified when really it's macroaggressions are just plain bigotry, and so that word can be tough depending on how you want to use it, but how I'm referring to it in this case is just the day-to-day lives of people of color on college campuses, and the things that they experience that I don't experience because I'm white, and how does that factor in to the work that we did. So then we tried to take all this outside literature and also connect it to class material and figure out where we were going next. So the things that popped into my head, the initial thing that popped into my head, partly because I read it, was The Killing Rage by Bell Hooks. And the thing that I initially thought of is that idea of Black rage. And I know we had a conversation about, like, is that a good term or not? But that was a term that Bell Hooks used, so that's the term that I'll use. And she talks about Black rage in the context of those everyday occurrences and how that builds over time and how that impacts your mental health and your ability to move throughout the world. And I think that's really relevant in college campuses. And also I thought that this quote was just exactly what we're trying to do as a group. So there must exist a paradigm, a practical model for social change that includes an understanding of ways to transform consciousness that are linked to efforts to transform structures. And we had a lot of conversations internally about, are we working on institutional racism or are we working on individual relationships? And I really appreciate that quote that, like, there has to be somewhere in the middle. And then the other thing that I thought about, and I won't read you the whole quote, but one of our colleagues read Between the World and Me, and something that I found really poignant about that book is the way that the author talks about his college experience and what it was like. And it wasn't just this physical place, but it was also this place where he got to really broaden his horizons and figure out who he was as a person. And if you haven't read that book, I would really encourage you to do it. And especially that part is just so beautiful and so inspiring. And so for people of color on our campus not to have that experience, we're never going to be able to create that here, but how do we make it a little safer here?
And then one of the things that I brought, amongst many other things, was the book that I read initially was Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. And so that prepared me going into this with kind of a language and things to keep in mind as a white person trying to address issues of racism. And just keeping that in mind, and also there's definitely a lot of moments in which our group realized that all three of us are white people and that we need to make sure that we're not just charging forward thinking that we have the answers, we've taken this class, we're prepared, like keeping the color of our skin in mind. And then also it did a really good job of outlining how to constructively handle white fragility, to not just push it aside or dismiss it, but to be okay talking about it with someone and answering those questions and also letting them express how they're feeling. So taking that into this RA training, so if there are any issues of white fragility, being okay discussing it and discussing where it comes from. Because if somebody brings it up and then you just push it aside and move on, there's no resolution there. They're still left feeling defensive. And then the other thing was that our group did a presentation on anti-racism training. And so with that, we pulled out various strengths used in training and general outlines and practices and just things to keep in mind. And it also was really good for bringing up problems and issues that people have in developing trainings or developing programs for other people. Just because sometimes you have a really great idea and then it turns out that there's a lot of unintended consequences that come along with it. So just being really mindful of that when approaching this.
Yeah, I read Promise and a Way of Life by Becky Thompson, and it was really interesting. She did fascinating reporting. She met with 39 different people and showed their stories as white anti-racists. And their stories ranged past 50 years of different movements. So she talked about how there's contributions and limitations to white anti-racism. And she showed the struggle of anti-racist education and how you can make it work in ways, but to be aware of those lines of what's crossed, and to make sure that, like what Julie said, that you're not just, look what we have here, this is what we're going to do. Like there's a point where you need to understand where you are, and that's what I'm trying to do, is understand where I am, and that's what we're all trying to do in this project. So I thought how she defines activists in different ways. Not all of the 39 people who did activism work define themselves as activists. And I thought it was an interesting term that was discussed throughout the book, and that there's a difference between the work people do as activists and just say like writings or books that are written about activism. Like there's a difference. Yeah, so I thought that was really helpful to understanding where my position was in this project. And then we are all the way on collective because of all the different groups that we brought in, Housing, we've talked to Empower Montana, the Black Student Union, Allies, and then it's public, between public and private, because the training is for RAs, so it's pretty private, but at the same time, if they get that training, using that in a very public place, such as the dorms, you're giving that, I guess, expressing what you've learned in a public place. So it's reaching out to the public through a private training.
Yeah. And so for us, just kind of outlining a little bit more the goals of our project. So we wanted to utilize our knowledge, the three of us, what we have, utilize our knowledge of student housing to aid and dismantle white supremacy, or at least make steps towards dismantling white supremacy. And we wanted to effectively address the issues that we've all seen working within residence life on campus. I think so much of this class we've discussed the institutional aspect of racism, and we felt that this was a proper way to go about addressing that institutional level of racism. And then working collectively with other organizations and stakeholders. In just a minute, my colleague is going to go over who we met with and who we talked to. But we realized that we didn't have all the answers, and we didn't have all the resources, we didn't have all the experience or knowledge, not to discount what we've learned here, but we kept that in mind, and we've spent, more than the average white person more time than the average white person thinking about our role in society and our role within racism, but that doesn't mean that we've fully arrived, and we still have a lot of work to do. And so we wanted to make sure that this was an inclusive project and that people who needed to be at the table were at the table. And so we tried to be aware of that when approaching this. And then we also wanted to create something that could live on outside of this semester. And so within meeting with Housing, they had already expressed interest in changing the training a little bit and altering it. So hopefully this will be the beginning of multiple changes and multiple alterations. So right now this training is targeted and specifically meant for just RAs. But I think my hope, and I think the hope of my colleagues as well, is that this will transcend to the administrative level of Housing as well, to have an actual anti-racism training for RAs and for administration in the future. And then also we wanted to positively impact resident RA and resident RA manager, we call them ACs, those relationships. Like I said before, hoping that this will affect the administrative side as well. And that RAs on the ground are ultimately there to address it at a very individual level, but that this will also impact the relationship and make it more cohesive, and that there's, Michael discussed, there's kind of this disjoint relationship right now when handling discrimination and racism. When it goes from the RA to that area coordinator, a lot of things get lost, and so hopefully this will make a more productive and more useful relationship. And then also we just ultimately want to promote a safe living environment for marginalized populations within the residence halls, because it is their first time away from home. It is a college experience. it is something that they're not used to. They already are coming into college with all of these life experiences. They've already experienced discrimination and racism within their daily lives. And so we want them to feel safe within the residence halls. We want them to feel comfortable. We want them to feel like they can express who they are without any kind of hesitation.
Yeah. So at first, what we did, we set up a meeting between the assistant director of, he's in charge of RA training, and Empower Montana. But then after talking to the president of the Black Student Union, we kind of figured, well, we have to have people who are on campus present in this meeting. So we ended up having the president of the Black Student Union there. We had Empower Montana, 2 people from Empower Montana, member of UM Allies, and one of the ACs, and John present. And it was more of a conversation than anything at first about what we wanted to do. We wanted to make them a part of the dialogue that we were having to set up a training. And John was a little, he didn't really want to just hand over a training to someone else. He wanted to make sure that everything was said, that he agreed that ideologies are good, but sometimes trainings don't match those. So he was a little concerned about just listening to us. He wanted to meet people. So what we reflected on from the meeting moving forward, we got kind of not called out, but there was discussion of who's not at the table, and that this is, there has to be more people involved. This is, people who represent like the Latinx community, the Native community on campus is humongous, and so moving forward, we told John that we send him a better proposal from what we got from the meeting. And then we met up and we decided to do something more concrete and look at policy, which is what one of the people at the meeting said, that you should look more into policy and see how you can intertwine policy and this anti-racism and anti-discrimination approach into your policy handbook. So that's what we decided to do. We decided to look at that and to also mark out a different type of training, which would be helpful for future RAs. And that's what we got from that.
Mm-hmm. And so from this point, we started looking at identifying those issues. So initially going into this project, we're thinking, all right, let's do an anti-racism training. We'll prepare that, we'll give it to the RAs. But then after our meeting and after talking with the various people at the table, and that suggestion of addressing it from a policy standpoint, we decided to go in a little bit of a different direction, and hopefully an anti-racism training will occur down the road. But at this point, we addressed problems within the handbook, which I talked about earlier. Focusing on the punitive measures, it didn't show how to follow up with a resident who had been a victim of discrimination, and there weren't really any guidelines on how to be an ally, which is really problematic, and it kind of left the resident assistant wondering what to do and kind of asking other RAs what to do, and the other RAs not really having the answer because there was not much in training, but there was also nothing in the handbook for them to refer to. And then we also identified problems within training. My colleague and I both went through the training in the spring, and it's a total of 40 hours of training, and there's a lot involved with that beyond the component of racism and discrimination. So there's a lot of policy and steps, and your job as an RA and everything like that. But there were attempts that were made within the training to make people aware of their privilege, to make RAs a little bit more empathetic and sympathetic to residents. but we fell short, and I spent a lot of time talking with my coworkers as well to kind of discuss what hit with you, what made an impact for you, and what did you think wasn't really productive. And so we took that information with us, and then we also wanted to involve the handbook more in this training, because so many RAs take the handbook and then don't use the handbook. But we figure by involving the handbook in the training, by explicitly using it in the training and showing them where these resources are at, they'll know that they have it throughout the rest of the semester. And then we weren't necessarily given the tools to understand and listen to a resident who was coming to us with the issues of discrimination and racism. So a lot of times, especially when it's taken as a microaggression, whether or not it is or not, a lot of RAs can kind of discount, like, oh, you're being a little dramatic, or, oh, it's not that big of a deal. And so we really wanted to make it more prevalent for the RAs to listen and to understand and to validate what their residents were feeling at the time. And we also kept in mind in addressing these problems that there's this new phase within Housing that they're going to do continual trainings throughout the year. So we tried to target our proposal and make it really narrow and effective, with the hopes that they'll elaborate later on, because that is the intent of Housing from this year forward. They're going to have continual trainings and discussions, which they haven't done in the past. And so with creating a new plan, our handbook alterations we worked on was expanding that resource information for the RAs so they have a better idea of who to contact, what resources are on campus, so the BSU and Allies and Diverse U, and so making them aware of that. And there were more follow-through, or more thorough on the guidelines and how to follow up. There was a scenario that we put in to our proposal for how to listen and how to make sure that that resident is okay, and emphasizing validating their feelings, and making sure that you continually follow up with them instead of having that initial conversation, maybe one follow-up, and then leaving kind of the situation and forgetting about the situation, which is really easy to do. And then also a reminder that the RAs need to be aware of their privilege and their identities when handling these situations. So a lot of times people, if they've never experienced discrimination or racism, it's really easy to discount or minimize someone who has. And so we wanted to make that evident for the RAs. And then for the training alterations, we wanted a more thorough look and explanation of microaggressions. And so I found a couple of resources that Katie had alluded to in her presentation on the literature that was used. And so using that to describe microaggressions, what they look like, how they make that person feel, and how multiple microaggressions can really affect an individual. Because there was a very short piece done in training on microaggressions, but it wasn't enough for people to actually understand what they were about, how it could really affect a person. And we thought that that was key in helping RAs become more sympathetic to their residents. And then a more productive privilege quiz. So the privilege quiz was basically like, if you never have to think about what bathroom you should use, then you have cisgendered privilege, and multiple privilege quizzes like that. And so that was helpful in identifying people's privilege, but then it was just kind of left at that. Their privilege wasn't discussed. It wasn't discussed how privilege impacts people without privilege. So expanding that a little bit further and giving them more concrete aspects of the privilege quiz. And then also how to address a roommate mediation involving discrimination. So in Michael's situation, a lot of times with the roommate mediation, RAs are told to listen to both sides. Each resident is right in what they're saying. Just don't take the side of one resident. But with issues of racism and discrimination, you can't do that. You can't be neutral when someone is discriminating against another person. And so addressing that issue specifically for racism and discrimination. And then we also thought that it would be really helpful for scenarios to walk through and to discuss. We didn't want to do role play because there was a lot of role playing in preparing RAs, but we felt that for this situation, it wasn't right to do a role play. And so proposing scenarios, and right now, Katie has brought forth a scenario that she faced as an RA to contribute to this. We potentially have another issue of discrimination that a resident wrote a response after being discriminated against, so that RAs can understand how it makes residents feel. Because a lot of RAs expressed to me that they didn't know what to do. There was no scenario, there was nothing to look for, there was no tangible way to deal with this. And then also at the end, surveying RAs so that it can be improved upon, because we recognize that the first time through is not going to be perfect. And so developing a survey or something for RAs to take so that Housing can carry this on and improve and make it more effective. And then the plan moving forward, so we wrote our proposal, we changed the handbook, and we sent it in to John, who's the director and in charge of training. So we're waiting for his response to see what he approves of, what he wants us to fix, adjust, enhance. And then we also want to make sure that we are involving every campus group that needs to be at that table and ask for their input, so it isn't just white people trying to have all the answers and solutions. We still want that level of accountability. And then take the proper steps necessary for it to be established and implemented in training.
So a big part of this process for us was the action reflection cycle and keep coming back and figuring out what's working and what's not working. So the thing that I think we came to on day one and kept coming back to is, if we are white aspiring allies, what is our role in this? What space can we take up? What space can't we take up? And what does that look like? And also, like my colleagues already talked about, white fragility, that in our experience, both like personally and anecdotally, and also in the research that we did for the anti-racism training presentation, that white fragility is something that it's not something that we can just deal with and move on, right? Like it's usually a process for people. Anti-racism trainings are usually long. They usually have pre-work and follow-up and all sorts of things of that nature that we can't do in such a limited RA training. Another really important part of anti-racism training work is it's very often something that people opt into. And even though RAs are choosing to be an RA, they may or may not be choosing to do anti-racism training. So that's where it shifted from anti-racism training to more of a training around policy in order to address discrimination. So how we deal with white fragility and how much do we try to avoid it, and is that ethical, is like also a question that came around for us. Another thing we talked a lot about is inclusivity, and there has been some concern around that there are so many campus groups and how do we possibly make every voice heard, but is that just another form of colorblindness? Is that sort of like a cop-out, you know? And so how do we address that? And also, thank you so much to those of you who responded to the class survey, both like to us directly and also on the survey. And I'll come back to those responses and sort of how we dealt with those in a minute. And then some other pieces that we had to keep in mind is timing, and as you've heard, RA training is really, 40 hours sounds like a lot, but when you see everything that has to be accomplished, it's not that much time. And so how do we do this in a way that's effective in a short amount of time? And we talked a little bit about financial barriers, but we are lucky that Housing does have money earmarked for this, so that is less of a concern at this point in time, though could potentially come back up as a barrier. So we wanted to start the conversation with you guys by bringing us back to the very beginning of class, and I don't know if I am quoting our professor accurately, so I apologize if this is wrong. But the idea around this was that there are often two schools of thought when we talk about white supremacy and defeating white supremacy and racism. So using relational work versus like institutional sources of privilege. So this is a conversation that we had a lot within our group, and I wanted to start by asking, like, what approach do you think that we are taking, and what parts of this project do you see being more individual or more institutional, and do you have suggestions around that?
Well, I think you guys are using both. I mean, a lot of the work that you're doing is relational because RAs are dealing directly with their residents. But also, I love that you guys are looking at policy. I know some of you were like concerned about this project, but I think it's amazing. And so the policy work that you're doing is at a very institutional level. And so I think you're addressing both, which is really, really cool.
Cool. Does anyone else have any thoughts or questions about this part of the way that we're approaching the project? Or are there things that you think we should be looking at from more of an institutional perspective or more of a relational perspective? I don't know if you specifically said this, but this is going to be ongoing, just in the way that we've set it up. We're going to, have to follow up a little bit. So this doesn't have to. So we will actually use the feedback that we're given today. Did you have something you want to say? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, if you guys want to follow up about this, we can go ahead to the next discussion question. And so we have a lot of different questions, and I thought I would give you a little bit of context to some of these. So, so one of the things is in terms of class feedback, we heard that having a resource, resources for RAs, so hopefully that handbook would address some of that, but also there are a lot of other resources that other organizations on campus and in the community have compiled, and so making that very specific and helpful for RAs sounded like an idea that we heard from multiple people. Also, something that I thought was really important is someone brought up modeling vulnerability rather than blaming, and I think that you've already seen that today in my colleagues, and something that we definitely want to bring to RA training, and rather than making someone feel guilty because they focused on the person who initiated the discrimination rather than the person discriminated against, just help them rethink the way that they approach that. And also, one of the things, and then a concern that someone had, which I do think is important, is what about the RAs who just sort of, and this is, I'm phrasing this, that just sort of show up and do what they're supposed to do but don't really think about it and then internalize it. And I think that that's something that we would need to continue to talk about on more of an individual basis, and I would imagine that that would be something that the administration would have to continue to work on. And also, I don't know if you guys would agree with this, but in my experience, if that's the way they're approaching that, they're approaching other things in the same way, so it's usually a larger conversation. But one of the things that I was really curious about is this question at the bottom. So we asked this, how can we encourage different groups on campus, including allies, BSU, ASS, DSS, and any other ones you can think of, to collaborate to make the best use of RA training? And my question around that comes back to what we talked about earlier in terms of what is kind of a cop-out and that oh, that's too difficult, versus how do we make it actually helpful for people. So a couple of suggestions we got already were to only allow some groups to speak, and then also to ask for resources ahead of time for those groups so we could sort of sort through it and figure it out. So I'm curious, now that you guys have heard what we've done so far, how do you think we can make sure that this training is as inclusive as possible without making it a million hours long and without diluting the specific needs of it?
I think it's really important to include those groups to review the material that you guys compile, but I think trying to include all of them in the actual process of training would not be possible. And also I think that it could be a stumbling block of an easy reason why somebody could say, oh, we're not going to do your training because you forgot X group. So it's actually not inclusive, so we're not going to do any of it. So, and I wasn't at the meeting, but that's kind of the vibe that I got from just hearing that you guys didn't have enough people at a 10 people meeting.
I think maybe, I don't think if it was quite that.
Okay.
And maybe we all interpreted that a little differently too. But yeah, I don't think that that was and that was a question that I had put on the agenda, is who else needs to be at the table. So that was a question that I had put out there. Awesome. I don't think that it was nobody was wagging their finger at us or anything like that. But they could have been. I mean, that's okay too, to call people out sometimes. But did you have a thought? Oh, sorry.
Me?
No, Erica, sorry.
I I think you could potentially ask groups that are able to come, and if possible, if there is a budget, like provide material compensation for groups that are able to come too, maybe. But also just being able to break up a 4-hour training with the actual groups, getting a chance to talk about what it is that they do, I think might have a little bit more of an impact than just like, here's 20 flyers from 20 different groups. But yeah, just making just not saying in the training, this is every group on campus, just saying, we got who could come.
Yeah, and it is difficult because there have been attempts in the past for Housing to bring in a representative sample of all the groups on campus, and more often than not, a lot of groups seem to not be responding, or at least that's the feedback that we got from John. And so with that, it does make it difficult to get everyone there to show up and physically.
And I guess maybe like that's why I said material compensation, which I don't know if that's the best way to do it, but just something to like acknowledge that you're asking a group to do a favor.
Yeah.
Saying, we're both working for RAs. I'm sure groups like UMLA support, well-trained RAs. But, they're still asking for their time and contribution.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Also, it might be helpful for you to know that the training is 40 hours total. Like,
Oh, yeah.
At a max, like, we haven't really figured this out, but it sounded like a max we would get is like 3, maybe 4 hours. Like,
oh, yeah.
So I just wanted to like make that clear because I don't know if that was clear.
So your last question is a very common response in predominantly white institutions, which I would argue is another expression of colorblind racism. And what ends up happening in those settings is most often as more and more issues are added to the table, racism is pushed to the back and usually falls off the table in the midst of that process. So my response in these settings is to say, given the particular history of this institution and its particular setting in a place like a white-dominated Montana, we will be intersectional in how we present this, but we're going to keep our focus on racism because so often that's the first thing to get lost. So I think there are some ways you can respond to that and acknowledge the importance of intersectionality, but also say we have a history here which shows if we don't keep our focus here, we won't talk about it at all. And we will be even less well equipped than we currently are because we said we're going to do it and then we didn't.
Did you have a question?
Oh, yeah. Well, more like a comment thing. Kind of going off what our professor said.
You
Maybe-
use my name.
Kind of going what Tobin said, like maybe in the actual training itself, focus on what is the biggest issue on this campus, which is, racism, which is kind of the big one, and maybe ask the groups involved to do supplemental trainings over the course, or not trainings, but discussions over the course of the semester. I don't know if that would be possible for RAs to participate in, but that way you can kind of keep some of the intersectionality while still highlighting what is the biggest issue.
I really appreciate that, and I think that is an effective use of like the follow-up meetings that are supposed to be kind of installed and in place, and we aren't a part of that process. That is just something that John informed us about within meeting with him, but I appreciate maximizing our time, staying concentrated on one thing and leaving the other groups to still have a voice, but it will just be following up later on. Yeah.
Well, and two, if you guys are focusing on like policy and what happens when there's discrimination, then I think that that's kind of a case-by-case basis anyway. So like as something comes up to your RA, then it's the RA's job to say, okay, where do I go from here? And so one of the areas you can go is like SARC. And then like SARC can point you in the direction of this is the particular group that you should pair the student with in order to solve this. And then that also creates like conversation between the student and SARC, so the student affected can get advocacy from that group. And so you guys are kind of like a go-between anyways, right?
Yeah.
I think the question where this came from more is like, that definitely makes sense to me on like the end of like logistically what happens, or sort of like what are the end results of this. But I think in creating it, what happens when there are groups on campus who feel like their voice isn't heard, and therefore like the discrimination they experience is less important. And so like how do we like that was sort of like where this came from, is like the initial part in terms of like making sure that people's voices are heard. And yeah.
Just want to note that I know there's the desire to eat cake, yet within the last 10 minutes of class we have. I don't want to rush you or cut you off, but if you can make some of the last 10 minutes available for the eating and serving of cake, I think you have some very happy classmates.
Yeah. I think if you guys have more thoughts or questions, if not, that's
Yeah, if you guys want to continue or address any of the questions that we proposed, but we can also make time for cake.
I think you just got your answer.
The crowd is spoken.
Yeah, seriously.
Jilly, can you go?
Everybody
It
else
pointed
around
out
that
to me that this
situation?
was not always a pleasant experience for the people who were being Toby-eyed.
If you need to bring out Toby.
I know, that's what I was.
We had other Tobys.
I asked the question I wanted to ask. My mind's on cake, I'm sorry.